The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. Great to have you back again this week. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If we've not met before and you don't know me, I'm an organizational psychologist, management consultant, logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Gusto now help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by building a dynamic, high-performance culture and inspirational leadership activated by meaning and purpose. And did you know that inspired employees outperform their satisfied peers by a factor of 2.25 to 1? In other words, inspiration is good for the bottom line. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal site, elisecortez.com. Getting in today's program, we have with us today the authors of Conflict Resilience, Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In, a toolkit for coming together in a conflicted world. Robert Bordone, a senior fellow at Harvard Law School, founder and former director of the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, and founder of the Cambridge Negotiation Institute, and also Joel Salinas, medical doctor, a behavioral neurologist and clinical scientist at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, founder and chief medical officer at Isaac Health, and former Harvard Medical School faculty. Slightly impressive human beings. We'll be talking about why people are so adverse to conflict and move into such aggressive postures when faced with it, or when they just completely run like I like to do, and learn to employ their three-part system to develop what they call conflict resilience for ourselves. Bob joins us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Dr. Joel joins us from New York. Welcome, gentlemen, to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for having us.
Really amazing, as I told you before we got on air, what you have created here in this book, Conflict Resilience. It's really, really stunning, impressive work. And you know, I could also hurt somebody with this book. It's so dense and full of information. The stories are amazing. You know, your story about your mom, Bob, in the shopping store. I mean, I could just so relate to that. I know I could just get cringeworthy.
And true.
I got it. And those things leave an imprint, as we'll talk about, I'm sure. So, well, let's talk about why this book is just so important. Talk about a timely book, gentlemen. You know, we live in a world of very divisive conflict today. So let's just talk a bit about why this book is just so important.
Yeah. Well, you know, we each came at this book with some differences in experience, but then a real joining about why the timing would be right. For me, I think this book, or the idea for the book and the idea for conflict resilience, started almost a decade ago. I spent 21 years teaching at Harvard Law School. And beginning about a decade ago, I started to notice a very perceptible shift in the kinds of in-classroom conversations. And to make something very complex much more simple, it went from interesting and diverse and sometimes conflicted to pretty dull and boring. And what I knew, because I was on the admissions committee, I knew that we were still recruiting very interesting people with very different political views, but that something had shifted. Yeah. And I did not think it was primarily the kind of skills. I mean, people have different levels of skills in this, and we can up their game. We hope our book does up their game. But that what had shifted was that people were less willing to actually enter into really hard conversations. Mm-hmm. They tended to, for a whole bunch of reasons that we can get into later, avoid, because it was easier to avoid, because the cost of the conversation might be very high in terms of kind of online cancellation or career cancellation. because of social media, people didn't really know how to disagree. And so somehow I gave a talk actually in 2018 where I used this word conflict resilience to try to distinguish it from conflict resolution. The idea being, if we can't actually sit with the discomfort of our disagreement, if we can't listen with generosity, and if we can't represent ourselves in an authentic way, but also in a way that increases the likelihood the other can hear us, then we could never get to the other things that I was teaching, which was conflict resolution or negotiation or mediation. And so that's kind of the world in which I started to think about this and started to see polarization, and then enter into this this amazing, wonderful friendship that I had with somebody literally across the river, because Harvard Law School is on one side of the Charles River, and Harvard Medical School and Mass General is on the other side of the river. So enter Dr. Salinas.
Yeah, I came at this from a different but related angle. So, I'm a behavioral neurologist, which means I work with people affected by Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. And a lot of the research that I've done has been really focused on brain health, and in particular, psychosocial determinants of brain health. So how our social relationships shape our brain health. And one of the things that I was noticing in the literature over time was just how rates of social isolation and loneliness have been steadily increasing, and really trying to understand why is it that we've been having this kind of really concerning trend when things like social isolation and loneliness seem to be really big health risk factors. It increases risk of mortality greater than obesity and smoking. I think in trying to understand any potential solutions here, I think one of the things that really became clear over time was just there's this real barrier or gap around connection, and specifically around how we can really navigate conflicts with each other. It's almost like we're missing kind of that kind of like childhood skill set to some degree that can help us figure out, when we disagree with each other, how we can get through it. I think one of the things that's just really clear about connection in general is that without conflict, there is no connection. So it's really interesting how we can be better at navigating that. So I was really fortunate to connect with Bob, who has a very specific skill set on how do we navigate these things. So together we brought in both the practical aspects of his field and my field to try to put together some really useful and usable tactics here.
I think it's stunning, and I love your collaboration. I do want to celebrate that. I mean, I've really been a big fan of lawyers in general because I love the way they think. You traffic in words, and it's just, it's stunning. And so, brain science, your world, Dr. Salinas, meets, the world of negotiation and law, and being able to use language to be able to connect and get a point across. I just really want to celebrate that you've come together to do that. How did the two of you come together? I mean, how did you guys actually meet and decide to do this?
We just met in the kind of larger kind of Harvard professional universe. And it turned out also, there's a lot of conflict in big research medical centers. And so I was actually doing some work at Mass General. Conflict is everywhere. And so we just became friends, really. I mean, this started more as friendship. And I will say, I very much credit Joelle on the idea of writing the book together, because I was kind of thinking about, is this book worthy or whatever? And then Joelle kind of approached me and said, would you want to do something on this? And my initial instinct was like, how would that work? But one of the great things about negotiation in general as a field, and one of my draws to it, is that it's deeply interdisciplinary. Yeah. And it always has been. It draws on game theory and behavioral economics, and then social cognitive psychology. And so why not brain science, right? And especially in this rapidly developing field that, Joelle has such expertise in. And so even though I think my initial reaction was like a little bit like, well, I don't know, and then like the more I thought about it, I was like, what a brilliant idea. So Joe, I don't know if that lands accurate from your perspective.
Totally. No, it was very complimentary. I mean, I would say we engaged in a lot of conflict as we were writing the book in terms of like
which you allude to also in the book throughout. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my perspective of like the medical world and sciences, I'm always trying to figure out, okay, well, what's behind this? Like, what's going on in the brain? How do we study this? How do we break it down into its component parts? And Bob has a lot of really amazing experience. He has a lot of kind of familiar with the research done in this area. But I always kept on coming back in with like the razor sharp kind of like science lens of like, wait, what's like, how do we deconstruct this? How do we replicate this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the funniest things about, like, I love when we're doing these podcasts because Joelle will say, "Oh, we had a lot of conflict," and I'm thinking like, "Oh yeah, not that much." But that's also one of our things in the book because
that's right. That's it.
We talk about this idea of conflict tolerance and the way people in general may experience something as getting to the level of conflict very differently. Mm-hmm. And so what for me might have been a very snappy, fun conversation about a story we might include or not, because I like to tell stories, or maybe Joelle like riffed on some part of the brain science that I was like, yeah, I'm lost here. I just thought that'd be fun. And then, at some point in our relationship, we realized that maybe sometimes Joelle actually thought we were more in a conflict. And that was, that in itself is interesting.
And I think this is so critical, gentlemen. One of the many reasons I wanted to have you on is so critical. I'll just quickly share, and then I do want to get into the promise of developing conflict resilience and what it really means for relationships, the world of work, communities, and the world at large. But I can tell you, my mother was married 5 times by the time she was 28. I'm from the first marriage. When I got married at 35 and started having discussions, whatever you want to call them, with my then husband. The first argument we got into, I was literally surveying the room to see which pieces of furniture I'd be taking with me, because conflict for me means we're moving houses. That's what it means to me. Right. And so that visceral feeling, that's, as I know you've taught us in the book, Dr. Joelle, that it got coded, right? Neurally coded for me. Mm-hmm. So I had to unlearn that over time, and I didn't fully unlearn it, frankly. So let's talk about just, what could the world and our relationships and our world of work, communities look like when we learn this stuff?
Gosh, I mean, I would just say it's just so much more vibrant, just so much more creativity, so much more connection. Mm-hmm. Bob has this expression that he says that I really enjoy, just like, all of the yeses don't matter until you get to the first no. And it's just so true. It's just, you can't really be truly authentic and without having some conflict in there. And so if you're really not seeing any conflict, something is actually not working. And so Bob and I share this, which is like whenever we hear kind of like new couples talking about how they never get into a fight, we usually just kind of like brace ourselves.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Was it just the first week? That's okay. If you're in month 8, I'm worried.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. We're not really connecting here. We're not really talking.
Yeah. Someone is afraid, or maybe both people are afraid to, say no, or say I disagree, or I see it differently. Mm-hmm. And there's just something about that first working through of the difference that gives you some more faith in the validity of all the other things that do seem to be working, in the sense that there's grist there. But I'm so empathetic with what you said, Dr. Cortez, because, and I'm sure Joelle can elaborate on this, that sense of the experience of being in conflict and all of the things that then make you say, this is all over, exit, run for the hills, right? Those are deeply encoded. Mm-hmm. And we think, you asked the question, and Joelle answered the question of, well, what is the promise of the book? And we think there's a huge promise for the book, and we want people to buy and read it. But here's the tough sell of it. It's a lot of self-work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I really get that, which I saw that utility and value tremendously right immediately as I was getting into it, for sure. Mm-hmm. Well, some people, of course, go into, more of the, the reactive, more, shall we say, destructive or violent behavior. I'm certified in crucial conversation, silence versus violence. But a lot of us tend to avoid conflict. So let's just first talk about, why do we avoid conflict?
Yeah. I mean, there is, it's from my perspective, it's very much grounded in the brain and these behavioral loops that we have and how we react to it. So when we perceive a potential threat, and this comes a lot with conflict, a potential threat of physical harm that our brain is there to protect us. Our brain will usually do the first thing to decrease how bad something feels. It makes things less bad. And those behaviors will usually be something along what we call the 5 Fs, these default reactions of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and fester. But it can be any other F probably, because the idea is just a behavior that we just kind of reflexively will do, that we've probably learned at some point in our life because it just worked, or we saw somebody it worked for somebody else. But oftentimes it works in the short term, but not in the long term. And so just because it feels so good to kind of make that bad feeling go away, your brain really weights that heavily. So that way you're just much more likely to default to that the next time it comes up, which is why you're much more likely to avoid the conflict. Or another form of avoidance is actually to plow through the conflict like a battering ram. And everybody has their own kind of specific kind of reflexes or default reactions depending on the situation or the person that they're in conflict with. Whether you're engaging a disagreement with somebody at work or with the boss can be very different than engaging a disagreement with like your parents or your sibling or your spouse or partner. So it's so much in our brain just is there naturally there to help us, but actually sabotages us from really accomplishing what we really would benefit us more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So appreciate that insight. Did you want to add anything to that, Bob?
I mean, no, the one thing I'll just say, which I think just is a responsive to the cultural moment of why everything that Joelle just said is on steroids in this moment, is not only does the brain get rewarded from that immediate avoidance, but we now have a whole bunch of tools available to us to get quadruple rewards. So what do I mean by that? Think about social media. Think about somebody who says something awful that you disagree with. You make a comment, they make a comment back, you make a comment, and then you know what happens? All of your people start putting hearts and likes.
Yeah.
The hearts and likes are feeding this pleasure thing, right? Like, my people come to me. And so no one's having an actual conversation.
Right.
And yet the brain is getting these rewards for non-engagement, because that's what it really is. It's non-engagement.
Mm-hmm. So important. There's so much we could take and we could uncover and unlayer here. But let's grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Robert Bordone, a senior fellow at Harvard Law School, founder and former director of the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, and founder of the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. We also have with us Dr. Joelle Salinas, a behavioral neurologist and clinical scientist at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, founder and chief medical officer at Isaac Health, and former Harvard Medical School faculty. We've been talking a bit about where this book came from. Why is it important to cultivate what they call conflict resilience? Why we avoid conflict? After the break, we're going to get into their 3-part system to help you develop conflict resilience. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, as I am dedicated to helping create a world where people realize their potential at work, are led by inspirational leaders that help them find and contribute their greatness, and we do business that betters the world. I keep researching and writing my own books. So my last one came out is called The Great Revitalization, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I wrote it to help leaders understand what today's workforce really wants and needs to give their best and want to stay. And then I offer 22 best practices to help you be equipped to provide that for them through their experience in your culture. You can find my books on Amazon or my personal site, elisecortez.com. If you are just joining us, my guests are Dr. Joel Salinas and Robert Bordone, the authors of Conflict Resilience, Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In, a toolkit for coming together in a conflicted world. You see, Dr. Joel, I told you I was going to default into Spanish. I can't help it. Can't help it. Okay, so let's, as much as we can, I really want to help our listeners and viewers get some idea of this three-part model that you have created. There's the name, which is And Dig Deep, Explore and Be Brave, and Commit and Own the Conflict. So I don't know where you want to start, but let's do this first. I do think it helps to make sense to give our listeners and viewers just a couple of examples of the conflicts that you showed in your book, because it'll help them realize that just how much conflict really is everywhere. And so we have the personal example of Katie, who wanted to celebrate Thanksgiving, but chose to be back in Boston with her husband and family and her mother's in Columbus, et cetera. And then we have the two co-founders, Joel and Julius, that have a business where they grapple with adding a new hire to the team. So can you just kind of situate kind of briefly those two examples of conflict so we can get our listeners and viewers thinking about conflict in their own lives?
Yeah, we could each take one of them, because one of them is a riff of a story involving someone I worked with, but it is a riff, I should say.
Okay.
But the second one is Joel's real story. So he's going to talk about that one.
Okay.
I wondered. But the first one is really situated in family, and a very common thing, I think, for a lot of people is where are we going to spend the holidays.
Yep.
But one of the things that, as we kind of work through this, we learn is it seems like a zero-sum game of, well, there's only one Thanksgiving, and someone has to be someone, either the in-laws are going to have Katie or her family of origin is going to have Katie. And part of the work is if you could have a deeper conversation about the meaning of what the holiday means, the meaning of what presents means, and some of the interests that both people have here. There's a way of opening this up. First is a way to have just more connection between, in this case, mom and daughter, because they're having not a fight, but a more authentic conversation about what's hard about this, what's complicated, but then also unpacking, an example that we use, that part of it is just how do we find some time for the whole family to get together, and the notion that it may or may not necessarily need to be on a particular holiday. So family is one big domain, but then Joel's example is really situated entirely differently.
Yeah, it's a work example. So, I mean, I think this is a situation that many listeners or viewers can relate with if you are involved in managing teams or responsible for hiring or bringing other people on. When you have a limited budget, right, for people to come onto the team, you have different priorities. And so the example that we share in the book is, where it was myself and my colleague, and we were trying to decide whether to hire somebody more senior in a role that we felt that was really important. And where the tension was I really felt that bringing on the senior person now would really help to kind of speed up our progress along, would make us a lot more competitive, would help to bring a lot more structure and kind of clear the fog of war when you're starting something new. Whereas the flip side of that was, that they're kind of expensive. We might have the budget for it. Maybe we should wait a little bit longer. And one of the things that came up in that conflict was there was a lot of back and forth on the merits of the situation, a lot of like pros and cons, but we weren't really getting anywhere with it. It was only until we really just had like a much more frank conversation about kind of the concerns that we both had around the situation that we were able to make some progress around there, which was kind of concerns about not being competitive, but also kind of existential threats if you run out of budget too quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, so important to situate so people kind of can dream about conflict in their own lives. So let's dive into your model here, your 3-part model, starting with name and dig deep. Help us understand what that's about. I know there is various chapters that address that one, but let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, this is the invitation and maybe the somewhat counterintuitive invitation of our book, which is that we imagine people are buying the book because they're thinking about a conflict with their mother-in-law or with their co-founder or with their boss or with their teenager. But the first part is really an exploration of the self. So when we say name and dig deep, what we're really meaning is trying to understand oneself, one's internal conflicts better.
Yeah.
We draw a lot on clearly some of what Joelle talked about in the first part, which is what's happening chemically and physiologically in our brains when we find ourselves in conflict. But we also do a lot of drawing on like internal family systems and parts work. How do we identify the different conflicts that we may have internally that if we don't address them well, we can't be as effective across the proverbial conversation or negotiation table? Because usually what's happening, for example, just to give it like a live example, in the avoidance move, there's usually a side of us that feels like we should say something and a side of us that feels like it's not worth it. Well, when we avoid, maybe to preserve the relationship, we have maybe pleased the other person. We've also pleased the side of us that thinks avoiding was a good idea. But you know who we're still stuck with at night? The side of us who thought we had something to say.
Right.
Right?
I know
The
that
side
person. Yeah.
Yeah, who actually thought like I did have a point there, or I do matter, or my feelings are relevant. And if we can't do that advanced work, that doesn't silence the side that says we should avoid. That's a real side. But that gives voice and life and legitimacy to the side that says, I have something to say, then we're not going to be prepared for the second part of what we talk about in our book.
As I said to you before we got on air, one of the things that I really appreciate about your book and your work that really aligns with some of the work that I'm doing in general is just, I see it as you're really empowering people to own themselves, their voice, what they want, and empowering them with a methodology to be able to step into that conflict in a much more productive, meaningful way that produces that growth that you're talking about and connection. And to me, what that really speaks to is now what you've done is you've elevated that human being in every way. And how can I argue with that?
Yeah, I mean, for the naming step, the other thing that I'll just add is just, even just the basics of naming how you're feeling, like putting a name to that physical emotion or physical experience that you have already helps to attenuate or kind of decrease the intensity of that feeling. There's been some good research, really looking at this kind of name it to tame it type of effect, where just taking a moment to just put a name, and the more specific a name you can give it, probably the better, because it starts to activate more of these kind of higher order kind of frontal parietal kind of systems that are really important for deliberative strategic thinking.
Yes. And then, as we described at the beginning of the show, when you guys were talking about writing the book together, you talk about the importance of understanding your own conflict tolerance. I mean, some people think yelling and screaming is just a conversation, it's a dinner conversation. For me, it'd be like I would be running for the hills, right? And the two of you clearly have a different sort of conflict tolerance as well. And I think that was a really critical thing that was an aha for me, was just really recognizing, and I knew it intuitively because of the work that I do. I do broker conversations between organizations or departments that are in conflict or have some issues together. And I could see that, but I thought that was a really critical thing to understand, and helping people to identify what is my conflict tolerance level.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it's something that has come up for me so frequently. And one of the things we talk about in the book, right, the idea of conflict tolerance, that an interaction that Joelle and I may be having that I might experience as a fun conversation that he experiences as affecting the relationship.
Yeah.
that's one domain, but there's also context in which it might vary. So I believe we talk in the book about another example where we were actually, it turns out, late on a draft of our book.
No.
Such a thing. And I was like absolutely dreading this conversation. We also had to tell them when we thought we'd get it to them. And I think both Joel and I were like, it's going to be a few months. But I was like, I was afraid to say that. I was like, well, do we say it'll be 10 days? Because that won't be so bad, even though we're not going to do it in 10 days. And for Joel, it was more like, whatever, it's going to be delayed, it'll be fine. And part of what was interesting is, at least as I understood and unpacked it, Joel is like this high, and this is true, but he'll probably deny it. He's like a high-end neurologist who like works with these like really complex patients and sometimes has to deliver pretty bad news on a regular basis that disappoints people. Yeah. And one thing that I'm really bad at is disappointing people. And so for me, I was experiencing saying we need 3 more months or whatever. I don't think we asked for 3 months, but whatever it was, 8 weeks, as like akin to saying to somebody, you have 2 months to live. And Joel was like, come on. And so there's like, I mean, he was gentler and kinder than that, right? But there's our tolerance, or what we experience as conflict, may even vary contextually. Again, because of the family in which we were raised, and our personality, and our own experience of, like, for me, I think when I disappointed people, it didn't go well for me.
And this is why, your first step is, of course, really digging deep. And as you say, this is some really intense self-work that profoundly help individuals, teams, organizations, families, communities, countries, nations. Yeah. So really, you can tell I'm slightly a fan of your work, gentlemen. Well, let's grab our last break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We're on the air with Robert Bordone, a senior fellow at Harvard Law School, founder and former director of the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, and founder of the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. We also have Dr. Joel Salinas, a behavioral neurologist and clinician scientist at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, founder and chief medical officer at Isaac Health, and former Harvard Medical School faculty. We've been talking in this particular segment about the first part of their 3-part model to start to be able to develop conflict resilience, that being to name and then dig deep. After the break, you're going to get into step 2 and 3, which is to explore and commit. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us, and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. I mentioned in the last break that my book came out, The Great Revitalization. What I did for you is I created a very simple 3-page free organizational assessment you can pull off my website, gusto-now.com. And that will help you understand the extent to which your organization is meeting the needs of today's very discerning workforce, and then decide where you can shore things up. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Dr. Joel Salinas and Robert Bordone, authors of Conflict Resilience, Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In, a toolkit for coming together in a conflicted world. So for this last segment here, gentlemen, let's take it home for our listeners and viewers so they can get a better understanding of your full model. We talked about naming our conflict and how we feel about it in the last segment. Let's dive into exploring and being brave as we do so.
Yeah, this explore step is important. I think one of the more fun ones, for me at least, because it involves two key steps, which is deep listening and effective assertion. And so the goal here is to really understand kind of what's driving you and the person kind of across the table from you, or the other person that you're in dialogue with. The deep listening, at the core of it, is coming at it with a genuine curiosity about the perspective of the other person, really to understand where they're coming from, what are the facts and kind of notions that lead up to the headline of what they're saying, with the acknowledgement that you're not necessarily endorsing their point of view by listening to them. And Bob can speak to this, but basically, those that do the best listening are actually usually much better at also responding and effectively asserting themselves, which is that other half of that exploration, which is then letting your perspective, your kind of point of view, really giving it a full-throated voice with confidence and clarity in these situations, and being able to really align kind of your brain and body behind what you're saying, so that way you're actually heard in that conversation. Now, Bob, if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, that sounds about right to me. So, I mean, it's easy to say, it's hard to do, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I thought was so compelling, if I have this in the right part of your model, gentlemen, was that when you really listen so well, and I know this from the work that I do too, because I've really literally seen people melt when they're really listened to. Is you talked about, this is probably your side of it, Dr. Joelle, where when people really listen with that kind of curiosity and that kind of genuineness, what happens is the other person kind of tends to soften and their stance and kind of meld into the listener. And they're more likely to be a little bit more empathetic or responsive to what the other person has to say because of the way that they listened. Do I have that right?
Yeah, no, there's been some really great organizational behavior work actually by Dr. Guy Itchikoff looking at listening in teams. It's really interesting to see that when you bring in tenets of really great listening, being able to kind of have a stance that is kind of positive and non-judgmental towards the other person, not being distracted, and being able to reflect back an understanding of what the other person is saying. In teams, it just builds better trust, more cohesion. Teams are more likely to innovate. Extreme points of view tend to soften, just as you said. And it's just really good for the team all around. But biologically, this is research that I've done. What we see is that people who are more likely to have a really good listener are also much more likely to have a really powerful cognitive reserve, meaning that their brains tend to function much better than even kind of their brain looks, just by the fact of having a good listener there. And it's also really powerful because to be a good listener doesn't cost kind of money, and any of us can be a really good listener.
One of the ways in which, like brain health, I would say psychology and law come together is around this listening piece. And one of the challenges in law school, right, is people think it's all about making arguments. And yet, at the most foundational level, going to court, if you ever go into a court, right when the judge walks in, the clerk will say, people having business before the Honorable George A. O'Toole, it's a clerk I work for, judge I work for, Judge George A. O'Toole shall come forth, hearken, and be heard. And why do you go to court? It's because you've been in a dispute with somebody and you haven't felt heard.
Right.
And so you're like, you know what? I need to go somewhere where someone is going to hear me and force you as well. Right. So this opportunity to be heard, which is foundational in your first year of law school, connects to brain health, connects to relationships, connects to so many different things. And yet we skip over it, or we say it's not that important, or it takes too much time. But we do that, I think, at our own, to the detriment of our relationships, to the detriment of our families, detriment of our businesses, So what seems like an efficiency move to skip over it actually ends up having really high costs.
No doubt. And one of the many things that I appreciate about your book is just the sheer number of examples. You have examples in there of people that are talking about, negotiating on different sides of wars. I mean, talk about, the criticality of being able to put forth, and explore a conflict with another human being. And to your other point about being able to sit and listen, even if you crazily oppose that viewpoint, to be able to actually sit and listen to that in a way that the other person can speak their side, really powerful. So, giving voice, as you say, and then setting the table. Remind me of what setting the table is all about.
Yeah, setting the table is really about how do we set up a process. That's kind of the fancy word for it, but the norms of engagement. Okay. And whether that is a conversation with, an elderly parent about maybe it's time to think about giving up the driver's license.
Yeah.
Now, are you going to sit there and say, like, let's talk about the rules of engagement with them? No, you're probably not going to do it that formally, but you probably should be thoughtful about when should we do this? Where should we do this? How do we frame it? That's setting the table. In a workplace, maybe a hard conversation with the boss, you might set up some other different kinds of process norms. If I'm facilitating a group that has to make a hard decision, it will look more formal. Yeah. But the setting of the table is, how do we create the conditions that maximize the chance that people can listen and also maximize the chance that people can and will speak? Because we need, and we didn't kind of get into the assertion piece, right? But we need people to actually feel like they are empowered to speak their experience, to speak to the side that says, I have something to say here. We want to create the conditions that make it lowest risk for them to actually do that.
Mm. So one of the many reasons I keep hosting this show after 10 years is that because this is an intentional way to catalyze my own learning journey. And I am called into organizations where there's conflict, where people don't feel like they can speak their piece. They've been it's a culture fear, or a fear of culture. And so they just have, the psychological safety is not present. So the third party comes in and can help broker that conversation to be able to get people to say what they really are so reluctant to say to the person they really need to say it to, not their colleagues, not somebody in the bathroom, whatever. Mm-hmm. So I can tell you, you're going to already help me better serve my clients by what you've taught me in your book already. And I hope in my own life.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there anything more you wanted to say about the explore step before we move on to commit?
No, I think we can move on to commit.
Okay. Let's talk about, what does commit look like?
Yeah, I mean, I can start us off, Bob. And so one of the key questions that we bring up with the commit step is really understanding and deciding for yourself whether to stay and engage in the dialogue or to walk away. And we provide some helpful tools to kind of sort through that specific question. But I think there's a couple of things that I think are really important to stress up front. One is that when we talk about conflict resilience, we don't mean to endure a really abusive or harmful situation. Conflict resilience is not about putting yourself at risk of harm, to whether it's physical or mental or emotional. We see this as tools to help to manage the discomfort that comes from disagreements with other people, but we don't want it to be an excuse for you to kind of really to put yourself in a dangerous situation. The other thing that comes up often in these conversations is around kind of if you're really struggling in having a conversation or dialogue with the other side, do I still try to engage? And in brief, one of the things that we bring up is just really understanding for yourself, is the other person acting in good faith or not? And that might not be very clear, but I think the key thing is the other person also wanting to kind of contribute to the relationship or contribute to the conversation in earnestness, and it may just be a difference in skills that's taking place.
One of the big challenges, I was on a call earlier today where this commit question gets mucky, right? This is somebody who, without getting into a lot of specifics, but it's an ex-spouse And there's a lot of issues around the kids. And there's a way in which exit isn't fully possible here, right? Because they're the kids, they're minor kids, and both parents want to be involved. But there are still certain decisions around to what level do I want to continue to engage hard issues, or where do I pull back and say we're just going to focus on kind of the facts and the logistics. And so there's kind of different ways in which people may make decisions around commit, right? At the basic negotiation level, we talk about how do you decide whether to buy the business or not, or walk away. At the relational level, we then say, well, how do you decide whether let's continue to have this hard set of conversations about our differences on immigration, or maybe we just leave it there. And then one step back, maybe the relationship itself is something that needs to end, and can I walk away from it, right? We can walk away from a friendship. We can walk away in a longer term, perhaps from a work situation, not immediately, but giving some people some tools to understand how to do that from a conflict resilient approach, which is different from run for the hills, we had a fight, as you mentioned earlier, but also not saying, well, to be conflict resilient, I must endure it all. No.
Joel, something to add?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you might have noticed that's been coming up more in culture is these concepts of like no contact, which really is a family estrangement. Mm-hmm. And I think there are certain situations where it makes a lot of sense to do that. But I think one of the things we're really advocating for here is that though there may be some other options beyond no contact that could still be really useful for the relationship, and really deciding for yourself kind of what is there in it. And one concept that we bring up in the book is this concept of the bigger, better offer, or the BBO. And I think this is a really important concept to really think about because it really helps us to really clarify for ourselves as vividly as possible, what is it that I want to get out of this? Like, what is the purpose behind this dialogue, this engagement, this hard conversation? Because really being clear on that will help to align your body and your brain towards being really authentic in that conversation, and also to really tolerate some of that distress that can come up from really thorny issues, knowing that there's something better kind of at the other end of that discomfort. And this is the process. It's not one and done. We really see it a lot like when you go to the gym to build the muscles. You don't go into the gym and start to lift the heaviest weights. You first start with low weights, get your form right, so that way you can slowly build up to lifting the heavy weights. And it's similar here. I want people to start with kind of relatively kind of more straightforward conflicts. Sometimes it can help to kind of give yourself a rating around the level of distress, these like SUDs or subjective units of distress. We want people to certainly be aware of when they're in the 0, 1, 2, 3 range, but we want people to focus a little bit more on the stretch zone of that 4, 5, 6. Anything beyond a 6 is probably too much of a stretch until you kind of develop those skills to manage it.
Oh my gosh, gentlemen, there's so much more we could talk about, and your book is so big and meaty and full of ways to help. We've come to the end of the show, though. What would you each like to leave the listeners with, say, maybe 15 seconds each?
I would say wherever you put yourself on your conflict handling capability, from I hate it, I can't do it, to I'm the best in the world, you can get better. The more you're aware of yourself, the more self-reflective you are, and the more tools you bring to bear, all of us can grow here.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that, this piece of awareness is so critical. Awareness is more than half the battle. If there's one thing you take from this book, is just being much more aware about kind of your experience of conflict and what situations you struggle and which ones you actually thrive in.
Gentlemen, I'm really, really grateful to know both of you, to have learned from you, to have shared with my listeners and viewers across the globe. I really look forward to staying connected. And I know our listeners and viewers are going to want to connect with you as well. So first, let me say thank you for coming on Working on Purpose.
Thanks for having us. We're so excited to be here.
Absolutely. Listeners and viewers, you are going to want to learn more about Robert Bordone and Dr. Joelle Salinas and the work they do, as well as their book, Conflict Resilience. And one way to start to do that is to visit their website, conflictresiliencebook.com. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. We were on air with Katina Sawyer, an associate professor of management and organization in the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona. She's also the co-founder of Worker Being and the co-host of Thriving at the Work podcast. She co-authored a book called Leading for Wellness, How to Create a Team Culture Where Everyone Thrives. And we talked about workplace wellness, why it's important, and what's in it for you as a leader to improve it, and then discuss several key behaviors leaders can develop to cultivate wellness in their organizations. It was very, very powerful. Next week, we'll be on air with Christy Smith, a co-author to the book called Essential, How Distributed Teams, Generative AI, and Global Shifts Are Creating a New Human-Powered Leadership. It's going to be a very thoughtful, provoking, and inspiring conversation about creating leaders in workplaces where people can actually do their very best work and want to stay. See you then. Remember that work is one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave, and give us the way to be able to do business that betters the world. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.